The Deep Space Research Station Weimar floated in the darkness above a giant purple planet called Kethros 7, and inside its metal walls, humans and dragons worked together in peace. Dr. Connor Webb was a 34-year-old veterinarian from Earth who had spent 3 years living on this station, and he loved his work more than anything in the universe. The dragons called themselves the Draconi, and they were an ancient and proud species that had traveled the stars for thousands of years before humans ever left their own planet. They stood 12 feet tall when fully grown, with scales that shimmered like precious metals, and wings that could carry them through the skies of any world. Their eyes glowed with intelligence, and their minds could reach out and touch the thoughts of others in ways that humans could barely understand. Connor had come to Weimar to study their biology and help care for their young, and over time he had earned something rare among the Draconi people. He had earned their trust. The Draconi only had children once every 50 years, and when their eggs hatched, the entire species celebrated with ceremonies that lasted for weeks. This year was a hatching year, and 12 precious eggs sat in the nursery wing of Weimar Station, waiting to bring new life into the galaxy. Elder Vorath was the clutch keeper, a massive dragon with scales the color of storm clouds, and eyes that held the wisdom of 200 years. She had allowed Connor to help prepare for the hatching, making him the first human ever permitted to take part in such a sacred event. He felt honored beyond words. On the night everything changed, Connor was in the nursery checking the temperature of the incubation chambers, while Vorath and the other elders performed their evening prayers. The eggs were due to hatch in 3 more days, and excitement filled the air like electricity before a storm. As he watched the eggs, each one glowing faintly with the life inside it. Then the world exploded. The first blast came from somewhere deep in the station, a sound like thunder mixed with screaming metal that shook the floor beneath his feet. Alarms screamed to life, red lights flashing everywhere as the station's computer announced in a calm voice that there had been a reactor malfunction in the lower decks. Connor grabbed the edge of a table as a second explosion rocked the station, this one closer, and he saw fire bloom in the corridor outside the nursery. Elder Vorath roared commands in the Draconi language, and the other elders rushed to protect the incubation chambers, their massive bodies forming a wall around the precious eggs. But there was no protection against what came next. A third explosion tore through the wall of the nursery, and Connor was thrown backward by the force of the blast. He hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, vision blurred by smoke and dust. When he looked up, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elder Vorath lay against the far wall, her great body broken and still, her storm-colored scales now dark with blood. The other elders had fallen too, scattered across the room like leaves after a hurricane. And the incubation chambers were shattered, their precious contents destroyed in an instant of fire and violence. Connor tried to stand, but another explosion somewhere in the station knocked him down again. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut around him, sealing him in a small section of the nursery with the bodies of the dead and the wreckage of everything they had tried to protect. The fires slowly died as the oxygen in the sealed section grew thin, and the station's computer announced that rescue ships were 14 hours away. 14 hours alone in this tomb. Connor sat in the darkness, his body bruised and bleeding, his heart broken by the loss of creatures he had come to love. He thought about the eggs, about the lives that would never be lived, about the hopes of an entire species crushed in a moment of mechanical failure. Tears ran down his face as he mourned. Then he heard something. It was a small sound, barely louder than a whisper, a tiny chirping cry coming from somewhere beneath a pile of debris near the corner of the room. Connor froze, listening, hardly daring to breathe. The sound came again, weak and desperate, the cry of something small and afraid. He moved without thinking, crawling across the floor toward the sound, ignoring the pain in his body and the smoke that still hung in the air. He began to dig through the wreckage with his bare hands, pulling aside broken metal and shattered equipment, cutting his fingers on sharp edges, but not stopping. The cry grew louder as he got closer, and hope began to burn in his chest like a small flame that refused to die. Finally, beneath a fallen panel and a pile of insulation material, he found it. One egg had survived. It was cracked and damaged, its shell covered in dust and debris, but it was warm in his hands, and he could feel life pulsing inside it. Connor cradled the egg against his chest, protecting it with his body, whispering words of comfort, even though he knew the creature inside could not understand him. As he held the egg, the crack in the shell grew wider. A piece of shell fell away, and Connor saw a tiny golden eye looking up at him from the darkness inside. More shell fell, and a small head emerged, covered in silver scales that caught the dim emergency lights and reflected them like mirrors. The hatchling was no larger than a house cat, with wings that were still wet and folded against its body, and a tail that curled around itself for warmth. It looked up at Connor with those golden eyes, and it let out a single, weak cry that somehow contained all the fear and confusion and loneliness in the universe. Everything else was gone. The elders who had devoted their lives to protecting the eggs were dead. The other 11 eggs had been destroyed in the explosions. The station was dying around them, and rescue was 14 hours away. But this one small life had survived, and it was looking at Connor Webb as if he were the only thing in the universe that mattered. He held the hatchling close and made a promise in the silence of that broken room. He would not let this creature die alone in the dark. He would keep it warm and safe and alive until help arrived, no matter what it took. The hatchling chirped again, softer this time, and pressed its small body against his chest. Connor did not know that this moment would change his life forever. He did not know that the bond forming between them was something that had never happened before in all the history of the Draconi people. He only knew that he was a healer, and there was a patient that needed him. So he held on tight and began to wait for the rescue that might never come. The 14 hours that followed were the longest of Connor Webb's life, and every minute brought new challenges that tested him in ways he had never imagined. The sealed section of the nursery was small, barely 20 feet across, and the emergency systems were failing one by one as the station continued to die around them. The temperature dropped steadily as the heating systems lost power, and Connor could see his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The oxygen was thin and growing thinner, making each breath feel like he was trying to suck air through a wet cloth. But the hatchling was his priority, and he refused to let anything distract him from keeping it alive. Connor knew from his studies that newborn Draconi needed specific conditions to survive their first hours of life. They needed warmth, somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees, because their bodies could not yet regulate their own temperature. 6 hours of hatching, a special mixture of proteins and minerals that the elders would normally provide. And most importantly, they needed the telepathic bond with their clutchmates and elders, a mental connection that stabilized their developing minds and taught them who they were. The hatchling in his arms had none of these things. Connor stripped off his thermal jacket and wrapped it around the tiny dragon, creating a cocoon of fabric to trap whatever heat he could provide. He pressed the bundle against his chest, directly over his heart, sharing his body warmth through the thin material of his shirt. The hatchling was so small and fragile, its silver scales cool against his skin, and he could feel it shivering as it tried to fight the cold. He began to walk in circles around the small space, keeping his blood moving, generating heat through motion. Hours passed, and the hatchling grew weaker. Its golden eyes became dull, and its cries grew softer until they were barely whispers. Connor knew it was fading, dying slowly from the cold and the lack of proper nutrition, and the absence of the mental bond it desperately needed. He had no food to give it, and no way to warm the room, and no understanding of how to form a telepathic connection with a creature from another species. But he refused to give up. He began to talk. He told the hatchling about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests and the mountains that touched the clouds. He described the ranch in Montana where he had grown up, the smell of hay in the barn and the sound of horses running across the fields. He talked about his first patient, a hawk with a broken wing that he had found in the woods when he was 12 years old. He had nursed that hawk back to health over 3 months, feeding it by hand and cleaning its wounds and talking to it every day until it was strong enough to fly again. The day he released it, watching it soar into the sky on wings he had helped heal, was the day he knew he would become a veterinarian. He told the hatchling all of this, his voice filling the silence of the dying station, creating a bubble of sound and warmth around them. And something strange began to happen. The hatchling's eyes grew brighter as he spoke, tracking his face with an intensity that seemed impossible for a creature so young. Connor felt a warmth in his mind that was not his own, a gentle pressure like someone knocking softly on a door. The Dracani were telepathic, and they formed mental bonds with each other from the moment of birth. Every scientist who studied them knew this, but every scientist also knew that these bonds only formed between Dracani. Humans did not have the mental capacity to connect with dragon minds. It was considered impossible. But the hatchling was reaching out to him, desperate and alone, and searching for any connection. Could find. Connor did not understand what was happening, but he understood need when he saw it. He stopped thinking about what was possible and started thinking about what was necessary. He closed his eyes and opened his mind. The sensation that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He felt the hatchling's consciousness touch his own, a small and frightened presence that pulsed with confusion and fear. It did not understand why it was cold, why it was hungry, why the voices of its clutchmates and elders were silent when they should be singing in its mind. It only knew that it was alone and afraid and dying. Connor reached back with everything he had. He showed the hatchling his memories, opening his mind like a book and letting it read the pages of his life. He shared the warmth of summer days on the ranch, the feeling of sunshine on his face and grass beneath his feet. He shared the love he had felt for every animal he had ever healed, the joy of watching broken creatures become whole again. He shared his fear, too, and his grief for the elders who had died, and his desperate determination to save this one small life. The hatchling absorbed it all like a sponge soaking up water. The bond deepened, growing stronger with each passing moment, until Connor could feel the hatchling's heartbeat as clearly as his own. He felt warmth spreading through its body as the connection stabilized something deep in its mind. The shivering stopped. The hatchling opened its golden eyes and looked at him with an expression that seemed almost like recognition, almost like love. Connor began to call it Ember, because of the warmth that now radiated from its silver scales like a small fire burning in the darkness. He held Ember close and continued to talk, sharing more memories, more feelings, more of himself than he had ever shared with anyone. Slowly, but they passed. When the rescue ships finally cut through the sealed bulkhead with their plasma torches, they found a human man sitting in the corner of a destroyed nursery. He was hypothermic and dehydrated, his hands covered in cuts, and his face pale from oxygen deprivation. But he was alive, and in his arms he held a silver dragon hatchling that glowed with health despite everything that should have killed it. The Dracani rescue team froze at the doorway, their eyes wide with shock. They could feel the bond between the human and the hatchling, a telepathic connection that pulsed with warmth and love and trust. Such a thing had never happened before in all the long history of their people. It was impossible. But Ender was alive and strong and refused to leave Connor's arms, chirping angrily at anyone who tried to separate them. The rescue team exchanged glances, unsure what to do. Connor looked up at them with exhausted eyes and spoke in a voice rough from 14 hours of constant talking. He asked them to please be careful with his patient. She had been through a lot. The news of the Weimar disaster spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and everywhere it went, it left shock and grief in its wake. 47 Dracani had died in the explosions, including the entire Elder Council of the Silverscale clan, some of the oldest and wisest dragons in the known universe. The clutch of 12 eggs that should have brought new hope to their people had been reduced to a single survivor. It was the greatest loss the Dracani had suffered in 300 years, and the weight of it pressed down on them like a mountain. But the tragedy of the disaster was complicated by something even more unusual. A human had bonded with the only surviving hatchling. Connor Webb sat in the medical bay of the Dracani flagship, surrounded by healers who examined him with equipment he did not understand, and asked him questions he could not fully answer. Ember slept in his lap, her small body curled into a ball, her silver scales rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She refused to be separated from him, crying out in distress whenever anyone tried to take her away. The bond between them was visible to every Dracani who came near, a telepathic connection that hummed with warmth and trust. It confused them, frightened them, and made them wonder what this meant for their future. The surviving members of the Silverscale clan were divided in their opinions. Some saw Connor as a hero who had risked his life to save their last hope, a human who had done the impossible out of pure compassion. Others saw him as an interloper who had violated their most sacred traditions, a stranger who had taken something that did not belong to him. The bond between a hatchling and its keeper was supposed to form with a Dracani elder, someone who could teach the young dragon about their history and culture and place in the universe. Connor was none of these things. An outsider, an alien, a creature whose species had only discovered fire a few thousand years ago, while the Dracani had been sailing between the stars. How could he possibly raise one of their children? The debates raged for days, while Connor waited and worried. He heard the arguments through the thin walls of the medical bay, voices raised in anger and grief. Some demanded that the bond be broken, that Ember be taken and raised properly among her own kind. Others warned that such an action could harm the hatchling, perhaps even kill her. Connor held Ember closer every time he heard those voices, fear gripping his heart like a cold hand. He had not asked for this responsibility, but he had accepted it the moment he pulled her from the wreckage. He would not abandon her now. Finally, the telepathic healers completed their examination and delivered their report to the council. The bond between Connor and Ember had formed during the hatchling's most critical developmental window, the first hours of life, when a Dracani's mind was most vulnerable and most open to connection. It had grown deep roots in both of their minds, intertwining their thoughts and feelings in ways that could not be easily undone. To break the bond now would cause severe psychological damage to Ember, possibly destroying her ability to form connections with others for the rest of her life. In the worst case, it could kill her. The healers were clear in their conclusion. The bond could not be safely broken. Connor felt relief wash over him when he heard this news, but he also felt the weight of what it meant. He was now responsible for this creature for the rest of his life, or at least until she was old enough to make her own choices. He was a human who would have to learn to be a dragon parent. The council summoned him to speak before them, and Connor walked into the great chamber with Ember cradled in his arms. Dozens of Dracani surrounded him, their massive forms towering over him like mountains, their eyes burning with emotions he could not read. He felt small and vulnerable, and terribly alone. Matriarch Sayla sat at the head of the council, the oldest surviving Dracani on the flagship. Her scales were pale gold, faded with age, and her wings hung loose at her sides like worn curtains. But her eyes were sharp and clear, and when she looked at Connor, he felt like she was seeing straight through to his soul. She asked him to explain himself, to tell them why he had done what he did. Connor took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. He told them he had not planned any of this, that he had simply done what any healer would do when faced with a patient in need. He had found a dying creature in the darkness, and he had refused to let it die alone. He did not understand the bond that had formed between them, but he knew that it was real and that breaking it would hurt Ember. He did not want to take her from her people or claim her as his own. He wanted to help her grow into the dragon she was meant to be. If that meant spending the rest of his life among the Dracani, learning their ways and serving as her guardian, then he would do it gladly. He would do whatever it took to give her a good life. The council chamber fell silent when he finished speaking. Matriarch Sayla studied him for a long moment, her ancient eyes unreadable. Then she asked him one final question. She asked him what he felt through the bond when he looked at Ember. Connor closed his eyes and reached into the connection between them. He felt Ember's dreams, strange visions of flying through clouds of colored gas and swimming through rivers of light. He felt her curiosity about the world around her, and her trust in the strange, warm creature who had pulled her from the darkness. He felt something else, too, something that surprised him with its strength. He felt love, simple and unconditional and absolute. When he opened his eyes, Matriarch Sayla was weeping, tears running down her golden scales like drops of rain. She had felt it too, through the echoes of the bond that radiated from Connor and Ember. She had felt the love of a healer for his patient, the love of a guardian for his ward, the love that asked for nothing in return. The matriarch rose to her feet and spoke to the council in a voice that trembled with emotion. She declared that Connor Webb would be granted provisional membership in the Silver Scale clan, the first human ever given such an honor in all of Dracani history. He would raise Ember alongside Dracani mentors, learning their customs while teaching her about the humanity that had saved her life. It was not a perfect solution, and many in the council still harbored doubts and resentments. But it was a beginning, a first step on a path that no one had ever walked before. Connor bowed his head in gratitude and held Ember close. She chirped happily in his arms, as if she understood that everything was going to be okay. Together, they would face whatever came next. The planet Drakkar Prime was unlike anything Connor had ever seen. A world of volcanic mountains and crystal lakes where dragons had soared through the skies since before humans had learned to walk upright. The air smelled of sulfur and flowers, a strange combination that burned his nose at first, but eventually became as familiar as the smell of hay on his childhood ranch. Connor made his home in a small dwelling at the edge of the Silver Scale ancestral grounds, a modest building made of dark stone that stayed warm even in the coldest nights. From his window, he could see the mountain peaks where young dragons learned to fly, their scales catching the light of the twin suns like living jewels. He had given up everything to come here. His career on Earth, his connections with other humans, his place in the society where he had been born. But every time he looked at Ember, he knew he had made the right choice. The years passed quickly, and Ember grew, faster than Connor had expected. Within 3 years, she had transformed from a palm-sized hatchling into a juvenile dragon the size of a large horse, her silver scales shimmering with patterns that marked her as a pureblood of the Silver Scale line. Her wings had grown strong enough to carry her on short flights around the grounds, and she practiced every day, determined to master the skies that were her birthright. She learned to speak both the Dracani language and English, switching between them with an ease that made Connor proud. Her flames came in when she was 2 years old, and she loved using them to start campfires when they went hiking in the mountains together. But life on Drakkar Prime was not easy for either of them. The other young Dracani did not know how to treat Ember, and many of them kept their distance. She was different from them in ways that were hard to explain. Too quick to laugh, too fond of physical affection, interested in the strange human music that Connor played for her in the evenings. When she got excited, she would bounce on her feet and wag her tail like a dog, behaviors that no proper Dracani would ever display. The other younglings whispered about her behind her back, calling her the half-human and the broken one. Ember pretended not to hear, but Connor felt her pain through their bond, a sharp ache that never quite went away. He faced his own challenges among the Dracani. Some of them never accepted his presence, viewing him as an intruder who had stolen one of their children. He received threats scratched into the walls of his dwelling, warnings to leave before something bad happened. He was refused service at markets and turned away from ceremonies that should have been open to any member of the Silver Scale clan. His career as a veterinarian had effectively ended the day he left human space, and no one on Drakkar Prime would hire him for any kind of work. He survived on the small stipend the council provided and the kindness of the few Dracani who had come to respect him. His family on Earth sent messages that grew more confused with each passing year, asking him when he was coming home, telling him about weddings and births and deaths that he had missed. He answered when he could, but the gap between his life and theirs grew wider every day. Sometimes, late at night, when Ember was sleeping and the house was quiet, Connor wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But then morning would come, and Ember would wake him with a cheerful chirp and a nudge of her snout against his shoulder. She would tell him about the dreams she had during the night, visions of flying through nebulae and swimming through seas of stars. She would ask him to tell her stories about Earth, about dogs and cats and horses, and all the creatures she had never seen. Stayed. The turning point came when Ember was 7 years old. A sickness began to spread among the Dracani hatchlings, a virus that attacked their lungs and left them struggling to breathe. It started with a few cases in the southern settlements, but within weeks it had spread across the continent. The Dracani healers tried everything they knew, ancient remedies and modern medicines and telepathic techniques passed down through generations. Nothing worked. The sick hatchlings grew weaker by the day, their scales losing their shine, their flames flickering and dying. Parents watched helplessly as their children faded before their eyes. The death count rose to 10, then 20, then 30. Fear gripped the planet like a cold wind, and whispers of extinction began to spread. Connor watched the crisis unfold with growing concern, studying the symptoms from a distance, reading every report he could find. Something about the virus seemed familiar to him, a pattern he had seen before in his studies of Earth reptiles. He spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing his old research files, comparing the Dracani virus to similar diseases he had treated back home. On the 4th night, he found what he was looking for. The virus was almost identical to a disease that affected Earth lizards, a respiratory infection that human veterinarians had learned to treat decades ago. The treatment would need to be adapted for Dracani physiology, but the basic principles should work. Connor brought his findings to the council and proposed a treatment protocol based on human veterinary medicine. The elders were skeptical, some of them openly hostile. They did not trust human science, and they certainly did not trust Connor Webb. But Matriarch Selah, who had become his quiet ally over the years, convinced them to give him a chance. What did they have to lose? Clock. Adapting the treatment for Draconi bodies, calculating dosages based on weight and metabolism, training the healers in techniques they had never seen before. The first patient was a small hatchling named Kira, barely 2 years old, whose parents had begged the council to try anything that might save her. Connor administered the treatment himself, his hands steady, despite the fear in his heart. For 3 days nothing changed. Kira continued to struggle for breath, her silver scales dull and lifeless. The healers whispered that the human's medicine had failed, that they should have never trusted him. Then on the 4th day, Kira opened her eyes and took a deep breath without coughing. Her scales began to regain their shine, and by the end of the week, she was chasing her siblings around the recovery ward. The news spread like wildfire. Other parents brought their sick children to Connor, desperate and hopeful. He treated them, one by one, teaching the Draconi healers how to prepare and administer the medicine, working until he could barely stand. The death toll stopped rising. Hatchlings who had been hours from death began to recover, their flames returning, their wings growing strong again. Within a month, the plague was contained, and no more children had died. The human who had saved one hatchling from the wreckage of Weimar Station had now saved dozens from a disease that their own healers could not cure. Even Connor's harshest critics were forced to acknowledge what he had accomplished. He was no longer just the intruder who had stolen a Draconi child. He was the healer who had saved their future. Ember stood beside him at the celebration that followed, her silver scales gleaming with pride. Through their bond, she sent him a wave of love and gratitude, so powerful that it brought tears to his eyes. "You did it," she told him without words. "You would." 20 years had passed since the explosion that destroyed Weimar Station, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Humans and Draconi had grown closer than ever before, their cultures intertwining through trade and diplomacy and the slow building of trust. At the center of this new relationship stood a silver dragon who had been raised by a human father. Ember was magnificent now, a fully grown dragon whose scales gleamed like polished steel in the light of any sun. Her wingspan stretched nearly 50 feet from tip to tip, casting shadows across entire assembly halls when she spread her wings. Her voice carried the wisdom of Draconi tradition and the warmth of human compassion, a combination that made her uniquely suited for the role she had been chosen to fill. She stood before the Galactic Council as the newly appointed ambassador of the Draconi people to the human colonies, the youngest dragon ever given such an N-word. Honor. The assembly chamber was filled with representatives from a dozen species, all gathered to witness this historic moment. Cameras broadcast the event to billions of viewers across known space, humans and Draconi and others watching together as history was made. Behind Ember, gray-haired and weathered, but standing straight with pride, was Connor Webb. He had aged in ways that Draconi did not, his joints aching in the morning, his eyes needing correction, his hair turned silver like his daughter's scales. But there was something unusual about him, a vitality that humans his age rarely possessed. The healers had discovered it years ago, a side effect of the deep telepathic bond he shared with Ember. The connection had changed something in his body, slowing the aging process, extending his lifespan far beyond normal human limits. They estimated he would live another century at least, long enough to see Ember raise children of her own. He had become a legend among both species over the years. Humans called him the Dragon Doctor, the man who had given up everything to save a single life and ended up changing the galaxy. The Draconi named him the Flame Keeper, an ancient title that had not been used in thousands of years, reserved for those who protected the future of their people. He had written books about interspecies medicine that were studied in universities across human space. He had trained hundreds of healers in techniques that combined human veterinary science with Draconi healing arts. He had helped establish the first joint human Draconi medical academy on a neutral station, a place where young healers from both species learned to work together. But more than any of that, more than all the honors and titles and achievements, he had raised a daughter. Ember began her speech to the assembly, her voice ringing clear and strong through the chamber, about the tragedy that had brought her into the world, the explosion that had killed so many and left her alone in the darkness. She spoke about the human who had found her, who had wrapped her in his jacket, and shared his warmth and his memories and his love. She spoke about growing up between two worlds, learning to be both Draconi and something new, something that had never existed before. She spoke about the challenges they had faced, the prejudice and doubt and fear that had followed them wherever they went. And she spoke about what they had proven together, that compassion could cross any boundary, that love could bridge any gap, that the differences between species were nothing compared to the bonds that could form between souls. The assembly listened in silence, captivated by her words. When she finished, the chamber erupted in applause that shook the walls and echoed through the corridors beyond. The young ambassador, tears streaming down faces both human and Draconi. Ember accepted their praise with grace, her golden eyes bright with emotion. Then she turned and bowed to Connor. It was a formal Draconi gesture, the bow that a student gave to a teacher, that a child gave to a parent, that a soul gave to the one who had shaped it. Through their bond, she sent him a single image, a memory they both shared. A human man in a dying station, cradling a tiny hatchling against his chest, refusing to give up, even when hope seemed lost. Connor felt tears running down his cheeks as he received the memory. He sent back his own image in return, the moment her eyes had first opened, golden and bright and full of trust, looking up at him as if he were the only thing in the universe that mattered. He had been a broken man that night, surrounded by death and darkness, with no idea how to save the life he held in his hands. Anyway, not because he was special or brave or chosen for greatness. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The applause continued as Ember spread her wings, a symbol of hope for two species learning to trust each other. Connor watched her with pride that filled his heart until it felt like it might burst. He thought about all the paths that had led to this moment, the tragedy and the struggle, the years of doubt and loneliness, the small victories that had slowly grown into something larger than he could have imagined. He thought about Elder Vorath and the other dragons who had died on Vaymar Station, whose sacrifice had made this future possible. He thought about the sick hatchlings he had saved from the plague, who were now grown dragons with children of their own. He thought about Ember as she had been that first night, tiny and afraid and reaching out for any connection she could find. She had found him. Held on. The ceremony ended, and the crowd began to disperse, but Connor and Ember remained in the chamber for a moment longer. She lowered her great head to his level, her golden eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said through their bond, "for everything." Connor reached up and placed his hand on her snout, feeling the warmth of her scales against his palm. "Thank you," he replied, "for giving my life meaning." They stood together in the quiet chamber, father and daughter, human and dragon, two souls bound by something stronger than blood or species or the vast distances between stars. The explosion had taken everything from them. It had taken Connor's career and his home and his place among his own people. It had taken Ember's clutchmates and elders and the normal childhood she should have had. It had taken 47 lives and nearly broken 2 civilizations. But it had not taken his compassion. It had not taken his stubbornness, refusal to let an innocent creature die alone in the dark. It had not taken the love that had grown from that simple act of kindness, and from that love something beautiful had grown. The story of Connor Webb and Ember would be told for generations to come, passed down from parents to children on worlds across the galaxy. Not as a tale of human superiority or Draconi tradition, but as proof of something more profound. That compassion offered freely and without reservation could change the universe. That the bonds between souls could transcend any difference. The single act of kindness in the darkest moment could light a flame that would burn for 1,000 years. And somewhere in the stars, in the debris field where Weimar Station had once orbited, the ghosts of the fallen could finally rest. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The future was bright. The flame was alive.